We are continuing the final section of our meetings of anthropology of culture and violence, and we are passing a word to Mikhail Nemtsev, independent researcher from Moscow, Kurtz, the apostle of violence, ideology and violence, and Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, and Ford Coppola, Apocalypse Now. Please, Mikhail. Hello. Thank you for the possibility to discuss some latent aspects of contemporary civilizations, some invisible aspects, and I want to pass from the Russian literature history to the mass global culture and literature of 20th century, and in that global culture, a man called Kurtz has become one of the symbolical figures who is embodying, in a way, violence in a special way. As we know, he emerges in Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, that was published in 1899, and for the modern man, he is more well known as a character of the film Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola. I'm starting with a very short resume of these two works of art. I don't want to analyze the literary piece as a literary piece and film as film. I am interested more what Kurtz can tell us about violence, or what the conception of Kurtz, the thought that stands behind him, can tell us about the role of violence in the contemporary civilization. But I first need to have an overview of the two works. In the novel, we have these events in colonial Africa. In the short story, and the main character that happens to be in the place of action, it is Congo, the Free State of Congo, the Belgian colony, and our main character goes up the river. He's the captain of the ship. He has to deliver a group that has to save an agent that is in the far post, and that agent is slowly dying on his way back, and he gives to the captain as kind of treaty based on his experience. And Marlowe, the narrator, comes back to Europe, to civilization, and he visits the bride of Kurtz, who's incognito but he calls her my intern. Coppola reproduced the fabula of Heart of Darkness, but the action takes place in the south of Vietnam during the hybrid war, because as we know that American war on Vietnam has never been officially declared. It was a difficult anti-guerrilla operation. He comes with some secret task to some kind of patrol boats, and his task is to kill the mutiny colonel who declared himself God, and he has to be exterminated. And here the American officer gets a task to kill the American officer. And Kurtz is killed. And during his murder, he's being translated on radio, and these translations are resounding across the film. And in contradistinction to the story, the film doesn't have the comeback, the return. It ends at the scene with the scene of murder, and I will always have to switch from one text to another, so seeing Kurtz as a kind of cultural myth, because the text of Heart of Darkness is a well-known in the Anglophone world, Western world. It's a character that overstepped the borders of the initial work, and it can be discussed. It can be discussed autonomously from the circumstances described in Heart of Darkness. And so can we describe the situation that Marlowe talks about? Can we see the situation as war in Africa? Yes, it's a colonial war. Of course, it's an undeclared war. And the ideology of colonialism rejects war as a state, and it's very state of affairs. It's important for the text to identify something happening in Africa as war can be done only by the reader, but for the people who are discussing European colonialism, it's not war, it's a civilizational process. And here in Africa, Marlowe, the narrator, sees that the whites are totally in advantage in the means of violence and suppression, but they always the threat of revolts remains, and he always underlines the fear of the white minority that the local population would revolts. And that's why they have to be held in the suppressed state. That is why the language through which they're described either as captives or as the war allies, or they are adversaries, and are against the colonial supremacy. And all the campaign is aimed at extracting ivory from the colonels, and the merchant expeditions are in fact the military expeditions. And Marlowe, in case of Heart of Darkness, and the captain and the officer in case of Coppola, they are moving upriver. And that's how we learn about Kurtz. First, we have some rumors. We are actually experiencing the increasing interest because this man was able, in a special way, to solve the problems that are raised before everyone. They are skeptical towards everything what they see around. You see the quotation. I won't read it. The scenes they see, the readers are skeptical. So the first is Heart of Darkness, and Apocalypse Now is also into letters A now. And Marlowe is for him it is very important to be psychologically stable, and he's very clear in his mind, and that's why he is counterposed to everyone else, and the other character is more vulnerable to the influence of Kurtz because he's psychologically more vulnerable. And so, what we can say about Kurtz? Kurtz first comes as a voice, because first, what Marlowe learns about him, he hears him, and in the film Apocalypse Now, the first introduction of Captain Willard to his future target, Colonel Kurtz, is when he's listening to his radio program. They are both Kurtzes are preachers, and the voice has as a quality of hierarchy. It is able to suppress. One person is talking, the other is listening. and nobody is supposing the answer. Then Kurtz is. We find out that he's a most effective agent or a most effective officer. He's executing his duty to the best, better than everybody. And at the same time, he becomes a traitor. And a strange controversy here is that for him to become more effective execution of his mission, he has to betray and to start his own game, so to speak. Kurtz is an agent of civilization. We can call him methodologist of civilization. It is less noticeable in Apocalypse Now, but Conrad is really putting a hard stress on that. Kurtz is writing. He's writing a certain treaty, which was ordered to him by a Society of Extermination of Aboriginal of beastly rituals, and it is written in a most flourishing language, and it is ended with a famous phrase, exterminate all the brutes.
Ну, я ее перевожу как перебить всех скотов, да, поскольку brutes все-таки скоты, но перевод этой фразы.
The translation of this phrase, it is a key phrase to all this treaty, because it opens up, it reveals the real attitude, of course, to the aborigines among whom he is working and whom he is supposed to enlighten. In the film, this phrase is reproduced in a different form: bomb and kill them all. And we know that there is an alternative ending to the film. Sometimes this film, it is a separate theme, the versions of Apocalypse Now. In one of the versions there is an alternative ending, and where they actually bombed them, and the whole camp of Kurtz and his adepts were killed, and Willard actually executed the order that Kurtz gave him. Kurtz is a methodologist of civilization, humanitarian expert in Africa. He appears as a preacher. Colonel Kurtz served in Vietnam in certain medical divisions. They were vaccinating the population, and then Kurtz is turning mad, and his authorities are calling him mad. His methods were unsound. There is a lot of translation to these words. In any way, Kurtz found a way to perform the task that he was given, but the method of how to do it, or how to solve these tasks, were unsound. They were unacceptable, because Kurtz is dealing with the main controversy of the war that he found himself at. It was a war where the very instrument it uses, violence, is always rejected, always written off. The violence has to be minimized, it has to be legal, and it has to be directed to the better purposes. Its final purpose is enlightenment, education, and reformation of the local life for the better. But those tasks can be achieved only through the indiscriminate violence, and that's how civilization becomes violence and destruction. And the last phrase that is being said by Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, his final phrase, in his he has his radio translation when he's being killed by Millard. We're teaching young men to exterminate people by fire, but their commanders don't let them write "fuck" on their planes because this is indecent, and that's how Kurtz is actually erasing the controversy. He becomes an ideal subject of colonial war, and his very image shows itself that the effective civilization is achieved by the indiscriminate violence. This is the truth of colonialism, truth, and which is embodied by Kurtz, and that's why he becomes, his existence becomes intolerable for his authorities. He acquires a superhuman status, as Conrad writes about it. He writes vaguely. He achieves his own becoming divinity himself, and the local population in Africa performs certain rituals where he accepts the worship. And in Vietnam, Kurtz becomes a military leader with absolute power. Kurtz simultaneously is a preacher. He writes, he speaks. Colonel Kurtz in Vietnam, he has radio translations, and he solves his own tasks. In the first Kurtz of Conrad achieves the task of the utmost gain, gets the most ivory. He is the most qualitative agent, best agent. And Colonel Kurtz in Coppola is effective in his anti-guerrilla warfare. He is formally accused in the killing of double agents, but it becomes an instrument in such a warfare, because the killing of double agents is the instrument in such a war. And also he creates traditions. In Africa, Kurtz, which we can gather that from the book of Joseph Conrad, he has and wandering Russian sailor becomes his adept. And with Coppola, it's a woman who is waiting for him in Europe, and he would create a cult for him. Oh, sorry, it was Conrad, a woman who will create a cult of him. And in Coppola, it's a journalist. It's actually a journalist. It's borrowing from the Russian sailor. But hasn't Willard become his pupil? Because in an alternative ending, he performs the Kurtz's order. He gives an order to bomb the camp of Kurtz, and he tells the story. He's bringing the news back to civilization, and apparently he stops being an officer. He says, "I'm not serving in this army," and he, in a way, continues with his cause. In which way, we don't know. And post-mortem fate of Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, one should pay attention to it. Conrad really paid a lot of attention, a lot of importance to what happened to Marlowe after his return to Europe. He wrote that if it was not for Marlowe's return and his conversation to this woman, all this book would have been an anecdote about a person going mad. But having come back from Africa, Marlowe goes to that woman who is waiting for Kurtz, and he finds out that she might become an author of heroic myth. This is a very important textual moment. She asks him to pronounce the last words of this dying man, that groom who is an embodiment of all that it is the best in humanity. And Marlowe, having to hide from her, suffering from having to hide from her who he really was, the last words he said was your name. But the reader knows that it was horror, what he says. So her name was horror. But this woman, would become a heir of Kurtz. He came as a preacher of progress to Africa, and one of the characters is quoting him and the ideals with which he came, and he left pupils after him, and so he's sort of dissolves himself in the European culture of the 20th century, showing that there is an irreversible ambiguity in the beginning, or that is hidden in the beginnings of this European culture. The necessity to civilize the world corresponds to is related to the maximum of violence. This is incriminate violence. It can be instrumental to the process of civilization. And Coppola might have not thought of Kurtz in this way because he had different tasks, but Conrad, that's how he was thinking about it. And I think that in this way Kurtz is an interesting figure for our understanding of how civilization is constructed. Here I want to finish. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you for your most interesting report. Colleagues, do you have any questions? Any commentaries? Евгений Пономарев and Carol. Thank you, Mikhail. It's an interesting comparison. I wanted to focus attention on the fact that Heart of Darkness is seen by many post-colonial researchers as a post-colonial text, and Apocalypse Now can also be viewed in this tradition of post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is supposing the confrontation of two cultures. There is an antithesis between colonialist and the colonialized. And does this antithesis have any bearing to your ideas? It's not post-colonial, it's anti-colonial, because post-colonial appears after the process of decolonization, and for Conrad, and he was writing from within. But in fact, there is a separate discussion. It was initiated by a famous report, Rechi Chebua, about the image of Africa, where he criticized Conrad as an apostolos of colonialism, and he showed that the text that was supposed to be anti-colonial is actually a manifesto of colonialism, and it was an interesting discussion. And I think that Achebe is an interesting discussion. Achebe was unjust to Conrad. Conrad was not anti-colonial or pro-colonial. He was interested in philosophy of individualism, but because he was an acute observer, the very description of the reality of African society and the scenes in the local scenes became made this text into an anti-colonial text just through acute observation. But a big problem for both works here is the lack of the overview, the lack of attention to the other. And post-colonial studies are about this attention to the other. The both Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, we are only seeing everything through the eyes of the representatives of Conrad himself, the representatives of chain of noble cause. The voice of the African, of course the Africans are talking there, but their observation there is lacking there. And Apocalypse Now, they're primitivizing primitivizing the local population. They're doing it conscientiously. One of the members of the members of the ship was being hit by a sparrow, but sparrows were not used on that war. And it's a direct quotation, but a quotation of the primary text, but to show that it's a primitive population that lives there. But in this way, we can see it as these are two as post-colonial works, but a very important criteria of belonging to the post-colonial literature or decolonial art is not observed. So that is why I don't think this is post-colonial. Carol.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. And I would like to use the opportunity to ask you something that I've been thinking about for quite some time. And I would appreciate your opinion on this. I mean, Kurtz is a German name, meaning short, basically.
Okay, I can
I always wondered, and I wonder what you make of this, because in a certain way, I wondered if this is an allusion to German philosophy coming in. I'm thinking of Nietzsche, or kind of this very closeness of civilization and violence, which was addressed also in his work. So I wondered if there's any context again in this way, especially because Conrad is a Polish author, writing in English but Polish, and at least kind of in German history now, or German history now stresses the continuities really between colonial policies inside Europe, used by empires, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, or the German Empire, the German being comparatively small, but still kind of having these colonial and using these colonial policies in its peripheries, which would for Germany be the Polish areas, Alsace-Lorraine, and also the Danish, against the Danish population in Schleswig. And so I wonder if there's any connection kind of between Conrad being this Polish author and him thinking about colonial policies and Kurtz being given this name.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Kurtz, as just if I can comment on the biography of a fictional character, he was his mother was French, his father was German, he was educated in England. So Conrad says of him as, quote, "All Europe contributed to formation of Kurtz." He is an European par excellence. In this sense, he is kind of a guy of no nationality. He's a European, and he works on behalf of a company stationed in Belgium, right? So, and in Europe, in Africa, he represents European civilization. So I think his nationality doesn't matter a lot here. So for Conrad, he was a representative for Europe at large, not just a certain country. There is a debate whether what actually did Conrad think about colonialism? It's interesting because he was born in exile. He wasn't born in exile, but he spent his time in childhood in exile in deep in Russian Empire with his father. So his father was a Polish revolutionary, and his opinion about Russian Empire was very ambiguous. For example, it's known that he could understand Russian, but he tried to present himself as a person who has zero knowledge of Russian, although he actually had it. So his relation to Russian Empire was ambiguous, and his relation to colonialism is ambiguous as well. So the Heart of Darkness begins with kind of discourse of the main protagonist, he looks several guys are sitting somewhere on a ship stationed in Thames, and he looks around at London and Great Britain, and he speaks about, once it was a dark part of the world, but eventually with this influx of civilized people, it became a part of the world civilization, right? But this, in the structure of the big text, all these discourse about the advantages of colonialism, of colonization, looks like ironic comment on what happens next, because the whole story shows colonialism as a very terrible thing, and you can't understand it in a different way. So for him, everything that happens in Africa is a crime. It's a terrible crime. So this introduction about colonialism is very ironic. He actually describes Britain as a result of colonial process in the past, but the colonial process in the present in Africa is like, you can say nothing good about it, right? So his attitude in this way is ambiguous, and there is a discussion about him. I personally think that Conrad has no definite opinion about colonialism, because it's my personal opinion. I think he was individualist. All his characters, they somehow represent his thoughts about ethics of individualism, right? So Marlowe is a very, very strict ethic rigorist. His ethics is very rigorous. For him, people are separated on those who can do things and those who can't. Whether they are Africans or Europeans, it doesn't matter. He deals with those who can do things and with those who can't make it. So I think he had no definite opinion about colonialism in general, but speaking about African Free State of Congo, he obviously was, his opinion was very negative. But it's obvious if you read the text. So this internal ambiguity in his attitude to colonialism as a part of contemporary world makes this text more difficult to understand. That's why people have all the discussions. What actually did he think about colonialism as political practice? And it's hard to answer. I suppose he didn't think a lot about it. But that's my opinion. I could prove it, like speaking about Lord Jim or some other novels of Conrad, but it's out of the discussion for today. Okay, so thank you for your question.
We have two questions from YouTube, and I'd like you to answer quicker, but because we don't have much time. Olga Nanurova, if we speak about visual portrait of Kurtz in the movie, it's already made, and in the book, the readers have to construct them. What does it give us as a figure of colonial violence? So I don't know, because the characteristics of film as a medium, they presuppose the visualization, the ready-made visualization. Perhaps what's important is that in the movies he appears as a voice with which Willett finds himself in dialogue without seeing the carrier of this voice. And during the physical introduction, and Kurtz appears very gradually from the dark, and he appears as a figure talking from the dark, and he's gradually appearing on the shot in this scene, giving the spectator to construct his image in the process. I think that here is it is a question of the characteristics of different media. Tatiana Borisova. So following Caroline, please tell to which extent today colonialism. Are there many colonialists in Europe, in Conrad, or they're different? So the question, there is a discussion. It's in the chapter of internal colonization by Alexander Atkin, dedicated to Conrad. To which extent Conrad was a colonialized subject himself, because he originated from the inner colony of Russian Empire. He's a person who changed his language twice and lived in a country of his own choice, and he spent a lot of time at the colonial margins in his most important periods of his life, and he described those margins. And the situation at the colonial margins was a repetition of situation in Poland. But I have to say there is a lot of literature dedicated to that. But I think that there is no decision to that, because it is only for us that this dimension of colonialism and non-colonialism is a decisive factor. But for Conrad, had other dimensions. For example, him being part of aristocracy that placed him in the rows of the elites of Europe. He has his own emblem. His noble birth is so important. For him, how was it important that he belonged not only to colonial culture, but to Britain as a colonial culture, which was an example of an enlightenment government of colonies in contradistinction to Belgian Congo. There are so many dimensions that have to be analyzed. He saw himself as a British citizen, which is an enlightened citizen. But there is no final answer to that, if I understood the question correctly. Thank you so much.